Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We are going to try to get to the bottom of a question that I'm sure has plagued many of us, which is why you might feel a bit dizzy after having your cup of coffee. So to answer this question, we're going to be checking out this really interesting article called Why Do I Feel Dizzy After Drinking Coffee? From a website called Coffee at Corner.
Sounds intriguing. I'm
hmm
curious to see what insights we can glean from this article. Coffee is such a ubiquitous beverage enjoyed by millions around the world, yet it can have such varied effects on people.
Yeah, and I was just reading through the article before we started, and it's funny because they were saying how coffee can be both good and bad for you.
Ah, the classic coffee conundrum. A paradox in a mug, you might say.
Right. Like on the one hand, it's packed with all these healthy antioxidants and, it's supposed to be good for your heart and your brain. But then on the other hand, it can make you feel anxious and jittery and sometimes even dizzy.
Exactly. And that's precisely what makes this deep dive so interesting. To really understand those dizzy spells, we need to kind of peel back the layers and see what's happening in your body when you drink coffee.
Right. Because it's like, is it the caffeine? Is it something else?
Right. Is it the way you're drinking it, the type of coffee? So
Hmm.
many factors could be at play here.
Okay, so let's start with the most obvious culprit, caffeine. The article says it gets into your bloodstream really quickly and goes straight to your brain.
Yeah, caffeine is like a speed demon when it comes to entering your system.
And what happens when it gets there?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Caffeine starts messing with your brain's neurotransmitters.
Oh.
Those are like the chemical messengers that control everything from your mood to your alertness, whether you're feeling sleepy or energized.
I see.
And that's why you often feel that initial boost of energy and focus after your first sip of coffee.
Right, I'm ready to take on the day.
Exactly. But sometimes that same process can lead to headaches and, yep, you guessed it, dizziness.
So it's like coffee gives you a jolt, but sometimes the landing isn't so smooth?
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that balance between the benefits and the potential downsides. And speaking of downsides, the article dives into something called caffeine intoxication.
Oh, now that sounds a little scary. What exactly is caffeine intoxication?
Well, imagine this. You've had one too many cups of coffee, and suddenly you feel fatigued, but your heart is racing. You might even get a headache or feel anxious, maybe even a little paranoid.
Huh, sound familiar. I've definitely had days where I've felt that way after overdoing it on the coffee. So that's my body saying, enough is enough.
That's one way to put it. It's a clear sign you've hit your caffeine limit and it's time to maybe cut back. But here's where things get really interesting.
Yep.
Coffee also contains an amino acid called taurine, which actually seems to have the opposite effect of
Oh, wait,
caffeine.
hold on. So coffee has something that makes you jittery and something that calms you down. That's kind of wild.
It is pretty wild. Our bodies are complex systems, and coffee, as it turns out, is a pretty complex beverage.
So tell me more about this taurine. What does it do?
Well, taurine can actually help stabilize your heart rate, relax your muscles, and even protect your lungs.
Wow, so it's like a little superhero in your coffee cup.
Right. Some studies even suggest it has mild psychoactive properties, meaning it might actually improve your mood and reduce anxiety.
So it's like a balancing act between the caffeine and the taurine.
That's a great way to think about it. They're both working in your system, but with kind of opposing effects.
Wow. So there's a whole lot more going on in a cup of coffee than I ever realized. But back to the dizziness. The article also mentioned something about dehydration. Does that come into play?
Oh, definitely. Remember how caffeine is a diuretic?
Yeah, makes you go to the bathroom more.
Exactly. And if you're not replenishing those fluids, it can lead to dehydration. And dehydration, my friend, can definitely make you feel dizzy and lightheaded.
So even though we're drinking liquid, we could actually be losing fluids overall.
That's tricky. It is. You're taking in fluids, but your body is working overtime to flush out the caffeine, and you end up losing more water than you might realize. It's like a sneaky form of dehydration, and it can really throw you off balance.
So staying hydrated is key if you want to avoid that post-coffee dizziness.
Absolutely. It's all about balance, coffee in, water in. But I'm curious, when you think about coffee, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Hmm. Well, I guess I think about that caffeine kick, that energy boost. But I also think about the taste, the aroma, the whole ritual of making a cup of coffee.
That's a great point. We often focus on the caffeine, but coffee is so much more than that. It's a sensory experience, a social ritual, and even a source of comfort for many people.
That's so true. I love the smell of freshly brewed coffee in the morning. It's almost as good as the taste itself.
It is. And speaking of taste, did you know that coffee is actually packed with antioxidants?
Oh, yeah. I've heard that before, but I thought those were good for you. So how can something that's good for you also make you feel dizzy?
Well, it all comes back to balance and individual responses. You're right, antioxidants are incredibly beneficial. They help protect your cells from damage and have been linked to all sorts of health benefits.
So are we saying that even though coffee can make you dizzy, it's still good for you?
It's more nuanced than a simple yes or no. It's like anything else, moderation is key. You wouldn't eat a whole cake in one sitting just because it has some vitamins, right?
That's a good point. So too much of a good thing can backfire.
Exactly. And the same applies to coffee. You have to find that sweet spot where you're reaping the benefits without overdoing it and triggering those negative side effects.
Okay, that makes sense. But I'm still a little confused about this whole dizzy thing. Is there anything else in coffee that could be causing it?
Well, the article did mention a few other possibilities. For instance, it highlights the fact that most people actually don't drink enough coffee to really reap those antioxidant benefits.
Wait, what? Not drinking enough coffee. How does that make sense?
Think of it like taking vitamins. If you only take a tiny dose, you might not get the full effect.
Okay, so there's a sweet spot for coffee consumption, like a Goldilocks zone where you get the good stuff without the negative side effects.
You got it. It's not just about how much coffee you drink, but also when you drink it and what kind of coffee you're drinking.
So it's all about finding that perfect balance for your individual body.
Exactly. And that's why personal experimentation is so important. What works for one person might not work for another.
It's like our own little coffee science experiment.
Exactly. Pay attention to your body's signals and adjust your coffee habits accordingly. If something's not feeling right, don't be afraid to switch things up.
I like that switch things up. So it's not just about how much coffee we drink, but also when we drink it.
Absolutely. If you're sensitive to caffeine, you might want to avoid drinking it late in the day, especially if you have trouble sleeping.
Right, because a good night's rest is essential for feeling our best. And if you're already sleep deprived, then adding caffeine to the mix is just going to make things worse, right?
Precisely. And if you're already sleep deprived and then add caffeine to the mix, it's no wonder you might feel a bit off kilter.
So sleep, hydration, knowing your caffeine limits, it's all connected. And speaking of connections, the article brings up some really interesting stuff about how our bodies actually process coffee.
Oh, yes. There's this idea of a cold effect from coffee, which might sound a bit counterintuitive.
A cold effect. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that mean?
Well, it's the idea that after that initial caffeine boost wears off, you might actually feel more tired and even a bit chilly. Your body kind of overcompensates for that initial stimulation, and you end up feeling drained and even a bit cold.
So it's like a caffeine hangover.
Exactly. It's your body trying to rebalance itself after that caffeine roller coaster.
Well, coffee is full of surprises. But wait, didn't the article also mention something about our taste buds and how they perceive the flavor of coffee?
You're right. It talks about how our taste buds pick up on these compounds called flavonoids and terpenes, which give coffee its distinctive flavor.
And the article makes this really interesting comparison to chocolate and cocoa.
Yes. It's like how you might crave the richness of chocolate, but choose to drink cocoa instead if you're watching your weight.
Because cocoa still has that chocolatey flavor, but it's lower in calories and fat.
Exactly. And in the same way, some people might find that they enjoy the taste and ritual of coffee, even without that big caffeine kick.
So it's not always about the caffeine buzz. There's a whole sensory experience involved. This is making me think about my own coffee routine in a whole new way.
I know, right? It's fascinating to delve into the science behind something we often take for granted, and there's still so much more to explore. Welcome back to our deep dive into the mysteries of coffee. Before we took a little break, we were talking about how coffee can be a source of both benefits and discomfort, especially those dizzy spells.
Right. It's like a constant balancing act going on in our bodies.
Yeah.
But before the break, you mentioned this cold effect that coffee can have that really caught my attention. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Of course. So, while that initial caffeine boost might make you feel all warm and energized, it also kicks your body's internal systems into overdrive.
Okay.
And one of those systems is your urinary system.
Right, because caffeine is a diuretic.
Yeah.
Right. It makes you pee more.
Exactly. And over time, that increased urination can lead to a loss of fluids and minerals, which can actually cause your body temperature to drop slightly.
So it's like our internal thermostat gets a little wonky. That's pretty wild.
It is. And when your body temperature dips, even just a little, your circulatory system has to work harder to keep everything running smoothly.
And that's where the dizziness comes in.
Bingo. Think of it this way. If your blood flow isn't optimal, it can lead to feelings of dizziness and lightheadedness. It's all interconnected. The caffeine kickstarts the process, the diuretic effect leads to fluid loss, and then the drop in body temperature can affect your circulation.
Wow, it's like a domino effect happening inside our bodies.
Mhm.
So paying attention to hydration is even more important than I thought.
Absolutely. It's not just about how much coffee you're drinking, but also how you're replenishing those fluids throughout the day. Making sure you're getting enough water is key.
Makes sense. So if you feel dizzy after your coffee, it might be a sign to grab a glass of water alongside it. Speaking of different types of coffee, the article also mentioned that not all coffees are created equal.
You're right. It's a whole world of flavors and caffeine levels out there. The type of bean, the roast, how it's brewed, all those factors play a role in how your body responds to coffee.
It's so true. I used to think coffee was just coffee. Now I realize it's like wines. There are subtle nuances and complexities to consider.
I love that analogy. And just like with wine, experimenting is part of the fun.
Yeah.
A light roast will have more caffeine than a dark roast, and a French press will often give you a stronger cup than a drip coffee maker.
So many variables to consider. It's like a science experiment every time we make a cup.
Exactly. And that's what this article is all about, encouraging people to find what works best for them.
Because what might energize one person could leave another feeling jittery and dizzy.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to coffee.
It's about paying attention to your body's unique signals and adjusting your coffee habits accordingly. If something's not feeling right, maybe try a different roast or brewing method, or even just how much you're drinking.
It's all about that self-awareness. And remember, coffee is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to your overall health and well-being. Other factors like sleep, stress, diet, and exercise also play a role in how you feel.
Right, it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But let's go back to that sensory experience we were talking about earlier. The article had some really interesting points about our taste buds and how they actually perceive those flavor compounds in coffee.
It's amazing, isn't it, how those flavonoids and terpenes create that unique flavor profile that we associate with coffee. It's like how our noses detect the aroma of freshly baked bread. It triggers a whole cascade of sensory experiences.
Yeah, and the article made this clever comparison to how we might crave the richness of chocolate, but opt for cocoa instead for health reasons.
Exactly. Cocoa often has a similar flavor profile to chocolate, but it's often lower in calories and fat. So in the same way, some people might find that they enjoy the ritual of coffee, the pace, the warmth, the whole experience, even without the caffeine kick.
That's so true. I know people who love the taste of coffee but choose decaf so they can still enjoy the ritual without the jitters. But the article also had some cautionary advice about relying on coffee as a quick fix, right?
Absolutely. While coffee can provide that temporary boost of energy, it's not a sustainable solution for chronic fatigue or lack of sleep. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger issue.
Right. It's important to address the underlying causes of your fatigue, whether it's stress, lack of sleep, or maybe even your diet, rather than just masking the symptoms with caffeine.
Couldn't agree more. Coffee shouldn't be used as a crutch to avoid dealing with those deeper issues. Now, this might sound a bit out there, but I'm curious about how coffee affects our blood sugar. I've heard it can have an impact, but I'm not really sure how that all works.
That's a great question. It is a bit complex, but basically caffeine can interfere with your body's ability to regulate blood sugar levels.
And that can lead to those energy spikes and crashes that many coffee drinkers experience.
So if you're already prone to blood sugar fluctuations, coffee could make those ups and downs even worse.
It's a possibility, especially if you're not paying attention to your overall diet. And those fluctuations can definitely contribute to feeling dizzy, lightheaded, and just generally out of sorts.
Okay, so that's another piece of the puzzle to consider when it comes to understanding why coffee might be making you feel dizzy. It's not just about the caffeine itself, but also how it affects your blood sugar and energy levels throughout the day.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of thinking about what you're eating throughout the day, too. Coffee isn't a meal replacement. It can't provide all the nutrients your body needs to function properly.
Right, a balanced diet is key. And speaking of balance, the article also mentioned that not everyone processes caffeine the same way, right? Like,
Yeah.
our genes actually play a role in how our bodies metabolize caffeine.
You've got a sharp memory.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. Some people might be able to handle 5 cups of coffee a day with no problem, while others are sensitive to even a small amount. It really just depends on your individual genetics and metabolism.
That makes sense. It explains why some people can drink coffee right before bed and sleep like a baby, while others need to cut themselves off in the afternoon to avoid insomnia.
It's fascinating how we each have our own internal caffeine clock, isn't it? But that's why it's so important to pay attention to your own body's signals and not compare yourself to others.
So true. We've talked about how much coffee we drink, when we drink it, and how our bodies process it. But what about the actual coffee itself? Does the type of bean or the brewing method really make a difference?
You're thinking like a true coffee aficionado, and the answer is a resounding yes. The quality of your coffee can absolutely play a role in how you feel after drinking it.
So it's not just about grabbing the cheapest bag of beans at the supermarket.
Not necessarily. Remember those antioxidants we talked about earlier? Well, higher quality coffee beans tend to have a higher concentration of those beneficial compounds.
So investing in better coffee might actually be an investment in our health.
It's something to consider. And don't forget about freshness. Freshly roasted beans will have a much richer flavor and aroma, and they'll also retain more of those healthy antioxidants.
I love that smell of freshly ground coffee in the morning. It's such a sensory experience. Speaking of sensory experiences, the article also mentioned the potential downsides of using coffee as a crutch, didn't it? Like relying on it to power through exhaustion or lack of sleep.
You hit the nail on the head. It's so tempting to reach for that extra cup when you're feeling drained, but in the long run, it might be doing more harm than good.
Right. If you're constantly relying on coffee to stay awake, you're not giving your body the rest it needs to recover and recharge. And eventually, that could lead to even more fatigue and potentially other health problems down the road.
Exactly. It's important to address the root cause of your fatigue, not just mask it with caffeine. Now, let's tackle a common myth about coffee, that it dehydrates you.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that before, too. Something about coffee being a diuretic, so it makes you pee more and can lead to dehydration. Is there any truth to that?
Okay, so it is true that caffeine has a diuretic effect, meaning it can increase urine production, but most studies have actually found that the amount of fluid you lose through increased urination is pretty much balanced out by the amount of fluid you consume in the coffee itself.
So as long as you're drinking enough water throughout the day, coffee itself isn't likely to dehydrate you.
That's the general consensus. Of course, if you're already dehydrated or if you're super sensitive to caffeine, you might want to be more mindful of your fluid intake. But for the average person, coffee isn't the dehydrating villain it's sometimes made out to be.
Good to know. And speaking of sensitivities, the article also mentioned that coffee can interact with certain medications, didn't it? Like it can interfere with how your body absorbs or processes some medications.
It's true. Caffeine can affect how some medications work, like antibiotics, antidepressants, and blood thinners, to name a few.
So if you're taking any medication regularly and you're also a coffee drinker, it's super important to talk to your doctor about potential interactions.
Absolutely. They can advise you on whether you need to adjust your coffee intake or make any other changes to your medication regimen to make sure you're getting the full benefit of your meds without any unwanted side effects.
Always better to be safe than sorry. Now, to switch gears a bit, are there any surprising benefits to coffee that we haven't touched on yet?
There are actually quite a few. Coffee has been linked to a surprisingly long list of health benefits beyond what we've already discussed.
Okay, like what? I'm all ears.
For one, coffee is chock full of antioxidants. These antioxidants help protect our cells from damage and may reduce the risk of all sorts of chronic diseases.
It's like coffee is sending out an army of little antioxidants to fight off the bad guys in our bodies.
Uh-huh, I like that analogy. And it's not just the antioxidants, coffee also contains other beneficial compounds, like caffeine and chlorogenic acid. Those have been linked to improved cognitive function, reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, and even protection against certain types of cancer.
Wow, that's amazing.
Eh,
It almost makes you wonder if coffee is some kind of secret weapon for living a longer, healthier life.
It's certainly a fascinating area of research, and while more studies are needed to confirm these findings, the evidence we have so far is pretty compelling. Moderate coffee consumption could play a significant role in boosting our health and longevity.
That's encouraging news for us coffee lovers. But speaking of moderation, how much coffee is actually considered moderate?
The general recommendation is up to 400 milligrams of caffeine per day for most adults. That's roughly equivalent to about 4 cups of brewed coffee. But of course, it's always best to listen to your body and see how you feel.
Right, because what might be moderate for one person could be way too much for another. It all comes back to that individual response.
Exactly. And what about people with certain health conditions? Is coffee safe for everyone?
That's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up.
If you have any health concerns, it's always best to talk to your doctor about whether coffee is right for you. They can help assess your individual risk factors and give you personalized advice.
That makes sense. It's always best to get a professional opinion when it comes to your health. Now, let's switch gears again for a minute. The article also mentioned something about coffee and athletic performance. Can you tell us more about that?
You bet. Caffeine is a natural stimulant that can enhance athletic performance in a number of ways.
Like how? Fill me in.
Well, caffeine can improve alertness, focus, and endurance. It can also reduce your perceived exertion, making your workouts feel less strenuous. So it's no surprise that a lot of athletes use caffeine to boost their performance.
So that pre-workout cup of coffee could actually give athletes an edge.
Exactly. Studies have shown that caffeine can enhance performance in a variety of sports, from running and cycling to swimming and weightlifting. But of course, there's a limit to how much caffeine is actually helpful for athletic performance. Too much can backfire and lead to dehydration, anxiety, and even impaired performance.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where caffeine enhances performance without causing any negative side effects.
Right. And the best way to find that sweet spot is to experiment and pay attention to how your body responds.
Okay, we covered a lot here: caffeine, blood sugar, athletic performance, but what about gut health? I've heard that coffee can affect our gut bacteria.
That's a great question. It's a relatively new area of research, but studies are emerging that suggest coffee may have both positive and negative effects on the gut microbiome.
Oh, can you remind me what the gut microbiome is again? I know it's super important for our health, but I always forget exactly what it is.
Of course. Your gut microbiome is this incredible community of trillions of bacteria living in your intestines. And these little guys play a huge role in your overall health.
I know it's involved in digestion, but what else?
It affects everything from your digestion and immunity to your mood and even your brain function.
Wow, that's incredible. So how does coffee fit into all of this?
Well, some studies suggest that coffee can actually increase the diversity of your gut microbiome, which is generally considered a good thing.
Because a more diverse gut microbiome means a healthier gut, right?
Exactly. Think of it like a rainforest. The more diverse the ecosystem, the healthier and more resilient it is.
So coffee is like a little biodiversity booster for our guts. That's pretty amazing.
It is. And coffee also contains prebiotics, which are basically types of fiber that feed the good bacteria in your gut.
So it's like fertilizer for those beneficial gut bugs.
You could say that. But on the flip side, coffee can also increase the production of stomach acid, which might be a problem for people with digestive issues like heartburn or GERD.
Ah, okay. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to gut health.
It seems that way. We need more research to fully understand how coffee and gut bacteria interact, but it's a fascinating area of study.
I agree. This whole conversation has been so insightful. I feel like I'm seeing coffee in a whole new light.
That's what we love to hear. And
Yep.
believe it or not, there's still so much more to explore when it comes to this amazing beverage.
Well, on that note, why don't we move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we can explore some practical tips for getting the most out of your coffee experience. Welcome back to our final part of this deep dive into the world of coffee and dizziness. We've learned so much about the science behind coffee, but now let's talk about what you can actually do to minimize those dizzy spells and get the most out of your coffee experience.
You know, it's funny, after all that complex information about caffeine and antioxidants and gut bacteria, the most important takeaway is actually quite simple. It's all about personalization.
Right, like finding what works for your body.
Exactly. Everyone's body reacts to coffee differently. What gives one person a boost might leave another feeling jittery and dizzy. The key is to really pay attention to your body's unique signals and adjust your habits accordingly.
Okay, so how can our listeners start this journey of coffee self-discovery? Where do we begin?
The article suggests starting with a little self-experimentation. Pay close attention to how you feel after you drink coffee. Do you feel more focused or more anxious? Do you get a headache or feel that familiar dizziness? Those are all clues that can help you fine-tune your coffee routine.
So it's like a coffee mindfulness practice.
I like that. Tune into your body and notice any changes in your energy levels, your mood, even your sleep patterns. It's all connected.
But right, so if you notice you're feeling jittery or having trouble sleeping, maybe cut back on the caffeine.
Exactly. And if you're feeling sluggish or getting those post-coffee headaches, you might need to adjust your intake or try a different brewing method.
It's like our bodies are trying to tell us something, but we're not always listening.
I know, right? We need to pay attention to those subtle cues and respond accordingly. And don't be afraid to experiment with different types of coffee.
Like different roasts and brewing methods.
Exactly. Each one creates a slightly different coffee experience, and one might suit you better than another. You might find that a darker roast is easier on your stomach, or that cold brew gives you a smoother energy boost. It's all about finding what works for you.
I'm already getting inspired to branch out and try some new things. But what about the timing of our coffee consumption? Does that matter?
It definitely does, especially when it comes to sleep. If you're sensitive to caffeine, that afternoon cup could be messing with your sleep cycle.
So that old advice about no coffee afternoon might actually have some merit.
There's definitely something to it. If you're struggling with sleep, try cutting off your caffeine intake a few hours before bedtime. You might even need to avoid it altogether in the evening to make sure you're getting a good night's rest.
It all comes back to that self-awareness and knowing your limits. And of course, we can't forget about staying hydrated.
You got it. Water is so important, especially when you consider that coffee can have a diuretic effect. A good rule of thumb is to drink a glass of water for every cup of coffee you drink.
Simple enough. But what about the quality of our coffee? Does that make a difference?
You know, it really does. Choosing high-quality coffee can make a big difference, both for your taste buds and for your health.
So how do we know if we're buying high-quality coffee? What should we be looking for?
Well, for starters, look for coffee that's ethically and sustainably sourced. Look for labels like Fair Trade, Organic, and Rainforest Alliance.
I love that. Our coffee choices can actually make a positive impact on the world.
Exactly. It's about supporting farmers and protecting the environment. And beyond ethical sourcing, freshness is key. Freshly roasted beans have a much richer flavor and aroma, and they also retain more of those beneficial antioxidants.
So ideally, we should be buying whole beans and grinding them at home.
That's the best way to ensure you're getting the freshest, most flavorful cup of coffee. And when you're storing those beans, keep them in an airtight container in a cool, dark place to preserve their freshness.
Awesome. I'm learning so much today. But beyond just the beans themselves, are there other things we can do to kind of, enhance our coffee experience?
Absolutely. The article really emphasizes approaching coffee with a sense of mindfulness.
Oh, I love that. So it's not just about gulping it down on the go.
Exactly. Instead of rushing through your coffee, make it a ritual. Take a moment to sit down, relax, savor the experience.
It's like turning your daily cup of coffee into a mini meditation.
That's a great way to put it. Engage all your senses. Notice the aroma, the taste, the warmth of the cup in your hands. It really transforms coffee from just a beverage into a moment of peace and enjoyment.
That's beautiful.
Oh.
And I think it's something we could all benefit from in our busy lives.
Definitely. Even just a few moments of mindfulness can make a big difference in our day.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the most important thing our listeners should take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is to remember that coffee is a personal journey. There's no right or wrong way to enjoy it.
It's about finding what works for you.
Exactly. Experiment, explore, listen to your body, and most